As I was saying
This
before
meeting is being recorded.
as I was saying before we got started today, this topic is really close to my heart because I've worked with so many people over the years who are solo agers. And so I'm really delighted to be here today and share this information. So my name is Sharon Dornberg-Lee. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm the clinical director of community services at CJE SeniorLife. We're a faith-based nonprofit organization. We provide a wide array of senior services, and we're primarily based in West Rogers Park, but also have a location in Deerfield as well, where we see clients and have residences. And so I'm so pleased to be with you today. Before my current role at CJE, for about 25 years, I was with our counseling team. So my background is in mental health and providing mental health services. Before I go further, I just want to thank the North Suburban YMCA. Thank you so much for having me. And we love, collaborating with you to bring programs to you and to your members from time to time. So I'm so glad to be here. And today we're going to talk about the topic of solo aging. One of the questions we'll try to answer is, if you are aging alone, how can you embrace that rather than seeing that as something that's, perhaps stigmatized, or it certainly has challenges, but how can one also learn to embrace it? How can you stay connected and develop new interests as you age, which is a key challenge for people who are aging alone? How does one ask for support? It's not easy for anybody to do. So how can you develop some comfort in that, which is often a key skill for solo agers to develop? And then what are some of the planning things? What do you need to do to really be the one who remains in the driver's seat about things that will occur in your life as you grow older? So those are our main agenda items and the things we're going to try to get to today. I do want to say that I've got two monitors here and I can see some of you, but there are many of you here today who I can't see on my screens. But I want this to be a conversation. But know that if you put a hand up or even a virtual hand up, I may not see you. So I'm going to ask for your help to let me know, and you can unmute if you have a question, or we can do questions at the end as well. So forgive me if you're trying to get a word in. Please don't hesitate to let me know if I don't see you. So first of all, what is solo aging? What do we mean when I use that term? Solo aging really refers to those who are aging without involved family and without a partner. So we're talking about folks who are aging pretty much on their own, just as the term suggests. They're riding solo, if you will. And one of the things that we look at when we talk about solo aging are the number of people living alone, which is not the same thing. I realize there are a lot of people living alone who may have involved family. And just remember to mute. I think that's why we were getting a little echo for participants, if you'd remember to mute. But one of the things that's kind of a rough proxy for the issue of solo aging, and to take a look at that phenomenon, is to talk about the number of older adults, which is growing, who are aging alone. And that's about 1 in 6 people in the United States ages 55 and older. Actually, this isn't even living alone. This is just no children. So about 1 in 6 older adults, if you count 55 and up, which would include me, don't have any children. About a third, more than a third, 36% of those age 50 and older live alone. And then for comparison purposes, back in 1960, about 5 years before I was born, only 13% of Americans had a single occupant, somebody living alone. So it's tripled in the last 40, 50, 64 years, the number of individuals living alone. So it's a phenomenon. It's a real change demographically. If you look at just the sheer numbers, it's about 26 million people who are living alone, and that's almost doubled just from the year 2000, so in a shorter amount of time. And then more than 60% of older adults who do live alone are female. It's more likely to be women than men partly because we tend to live longer. So if that category does apply to you of a solo ager, somebody aging without significant support from family or partner, these are some of the challenges that we're going to talk about today. Things that are within your control that you can do to improve the quality of your aging and some of the outcomes, if you will, for yourself as you're growing older, or this may apply to people you know, and you might want to share this information with them or with your communities. So one of the challenges for solo agers is to stay connected, or if you're not already connected with other individuals or communities or groups, to learn ways to get connected in the first place. Developing new interests as one gets older is often important, and especially for solo agers, because that's often how we meet people. And sometimes, unfortunately, as we age, our previous interests are kind of not available to us anymore. It may be that you met a lot of the people you know through work or through a club that you're not able physically to participate in anymore if you have disabilities as you grow older. So aging is really a continual process of adaptation, and those who are able to adapt tend to do better. And I can just say that from my many years of experience as a therapist. My clients who struggled the most were the ones who were sort of least willing to try to adapt. There was a reluctance to make change because change is so hard, right? Adaptation, developing new interests, not easy. So people who were able to achieve that and develop new interests or stay connected to their hobbies and interests as they aged are the ones who fared the best, especially among those aging alone. We're going to talk a little bit about learning more about community resources, just what's out there to help people as they age, and especially if they're aging alone. What are some of the advanced planning tools that people can use? We'll talk about that and who can help you. And then just this idea of having an active problem-solving approach. Again, this idea of adaptation. Instead of passively kind of having things not go well and thinking, well, this is unfortunate, but it's the way it is. Those who say, no, what can I do about this? How can I actively adapt? Are the ones who are going to kind of best be able to age successfully, and especially if they're doing so alone. And then this last one sounds a little strange, focusing on gratitude. And I have to say, I was not always a big believer when people talked about a gratitude practice. It sounds a little corny, or like maybe it's disallowing or devaluing the negative. And it's so important to be able to, be honest and be real and say, some things are not going well. There's some really hard things. But what I've learned is that you can do both, and that focusing on some of the things, or even a single thing that is going well, is really good for our mental health and kind of gets us in that adaptive mindset that I think is so important. So we'll say a little bit more about that. I do want to emphasize that being a solo ager, if to use that term, or aging alone, it's not really a problem inherently. Some people really enjoy being solo agers, and when it becomes problematic is when people become socially isolated. So being a solo ager, not inherently problematic if you use some of the tools and resources we're going to talk about today, but it can become problematic for those who end up not connected to other people at all. And we'll talk a little bit about the data about why that's problematic. But for some people, as they get older and they're aging alone, they may have a real sense of freedom. Yes, loss, if you were somebody who had a partner that you lost, for example, God forbid, that's a horrible thing to have to go through. But sometimes there also can be a sense of autonomy, new opportunities. I think of my own grandmother, who, to be honest, didn't have a great marriage with my grandfather. He was a challenging person, and then he had dementia for many years. She was his caregiver. And so she loved him. When he died, she grieved him, but she also expressed that she had this sense of like this time suddenly that was her own. She also had an adult child who had a disability who passed. And so there was this sense that, suddenly now her time was her own and she had the freedom to do as she pleased. So it's just sort of an example of how the fact that it can be sad, yes, for people who've had losses, but also a time of liberation and freedom for some, or for those who chose not to have a partner, can really sometimes be living their best life. I have a friend like that who's very socially connected and really enjoys her single life. So not inherently problematic. But social isolation, where we are not connecting with others at all, is inherently problematic because there are a lot of health repercussions. So I wanted to talk a little bit about those, not to scare anybody, but just to make you aware, right? It's a health information that people should have. So just before the pandemic in 2020, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine did a big study on social isolation. It was called Social Isolation and Loneliness in Older Adults, Opportunities for the Healthcare System. And it came out in like January of 2020. So of course the data got even worse with the pandemic when so many of us were socially isolated. But what they found was even in 2020, about 1/4, 1 out of every 4 older adults are socially isolated. And socially isolated means somebody who objectively, not a subjective sense, but objectively lacks social connection to nearly all others. So think about that for a second. 1 out of every 4 older adults doesn't really have a close connection to anybody. They're the folks who say my phone never rings to me, or the only person I ever see is the home delivered meals driver, or, just really quite alone. And that's 1 out of 4 of us, which is really a shocking number. Loneliness, on the other hand, is kind of a different but related concept, which is our subjective sense of feeling alone. So for many people, they've described like, oh yeah, I went to a party or I went to a family get together. There were lots of people there, but I just feel lonely. I don't feel like I'm really connecting. I don't really feel understood. I don't feel there's anybody I can confide in. So that's a related but different concept of loneliness. So for some people, and for many people, if they're socially isolated, they may feel lonely, and others can feel lonely without being socially isolated. And what this study shared was some of the alarming risk factors associated with social isolation. It increases the risk of early death from all causes, from any type of disease, as much as smoking does. 3/4 of a pack a day, the risk is comparable to being socially isolated, or being completely physically inactive. Being socially isolated puts you as much risk as somebody who is really completely sedentary. There's also, and this shocked me, and I'm sure it may shock you if you haven't heard this before, there's a 50% increased risk of developing dementia if you're socially isolated and stay that way. Also, people had increased risk of things you wouldn't think would necessarily connect, but things like heart disease, increased risk of stroke. People were at much more risk, about 1/3 more for these diseases just by being socially isolated. People who were lonely, among heart failure patients, they had a 4 times increased risk of death. Think about that, as compared to people who had heart failure but did not identify as lonely. 68% increased risk of hospitalization, 57% increased risk of ER visits. And then, less surprisingly, loneliness was associated with poorer mental health outcomes, which makes a little more intuitive sense, right? That people who identify as being lonely have higher rates of depression and anxiety and even higher rates of suicide. After this report, just about a year ago, I think, although I have a horrible sense of time, maybe it was longer, the Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. Vivek Murthy, came out with a report called Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation. And, he really talked about social isolation and loneliness as a social diagnosis. And he was talking about Americans in general, not just older adults, how widespread this is, that people are isolated or feel lonely or both. And I think it's really a step forward to talk about social isolation as a social disease, as a social diagnosis. This idea that it's not your fault or your fault or your fault if you're isolated. It's a societal problem. It's a societal illness. Why are we so divided? What has happened to our communities and our institutions and our social structures and our relationships? What has technology done? Why are we feeling so isolated and alone that it's become so widespread? So again, this was sort of another report that focused a lot of attention on social isolation. And then the pandemic made things worse. I'm not going to focus on that today because hopefully we're coming back from that. But I know for some of you who are in higher risk categories, you may still be avoiding crowded situations and social situations. So there's a lasting impact too from the pandemic. And by the way, I'll share all these slides with the Y so they can share them all with you. The other thing I was going to say too is at the end of the slides, I'm sure we won't get to it all of it today in our hour, but I will share these slides because at the end there are tons of resources that will list like places that you can reach out to for help and support. So I'll talk about those generally, but you'll also have those resources to take with you. But first I wanted to say a little bit about why is it that social isolation, which I realize is different than being a solo ager, but I wanted to talk about both. Why is it that folks who are socially isolated are at higher risk of health consequences? And there are a few theories about that. And the first is what they call the behavioral link. This idea that, and these are theories, right? They're not fully tested or proven. But the theory is that the behavioral link is that those who are isolated might be more likely to engage in risky health behaviors, like not exercising, like smoking. And I think about like my partner saying, let's go for a walk, or somebody who says to their partner, like, you must quit smoking. So those kinds of things that other people can do for us to encourage us to engage in healthier behaviors, or that we might want to do for them, but if we're on our own, we might be less likely to do. Just like I think if I'm cooking dinner for myself, I'm probably have a bowl of cereal. If I'm cooking dinner, for friends or family, I'm gonna, make it a more balanced meal, that kind of thing. We make more of an effort due to relationship. So that's one theory. The other theory is that there is a psychological link that if we're lonely and we're isolated, we all get self-esteem through relationship. It's not just something where we wake up with self-esteem. We feel good about ourselves through relationship with other people, so that those who are lonely and isolated might have lower self-esteem and therefore have lower active coping mechanisms. They're less likely to feel a sense that they can influence the outcome of things. Why bother if you don't feel very confident? And therefore they may be less likely to engage in coping mechanisms that could lead to good health outcomes, like going to the doctor, for example. And then the third theory, and there's some evidence of this, is that there's a direct physiological link between isolation and good health, and that our immune system is actually affected. Our blood pressure is affected by being alone versus being with other people. So the likelihood is that all of these things are a factor in poor health outcomes for people who are socially isolated. And they're all things that we can influence, right? That we can work on and try to change those outcomes. Again, I want to make the point that when folks are isolated, it's usually not in any way their fault. It's related to all these things that we call social determinants of health. And we're learning more and more about how these social factors affect our health. And so for those, especially who may be living in poverty or living in unsafe communities or not have access to affordable housing, which is such a big issue in our area, transportation is such a big issue for older adults. All of these societal things, or all these things that are part of our built society, are the things that really contribute to and can cause social isolation or make social isolation worse. Excuse me, make it a trickier problem to solve. Excuse me. So what are the things we can do about this? What are some of the opportunities to connect? And sometimes people describe technology as something that can be distancing or get in the way, like spending all your time on your phone or whatever. But technology can also be something that can help you connect, that can be really valuable. And older adults tend to have less experiences with computers. So are there ways that you can use the internet and other, online resources to connect with other people? And so one of the things that we encourage people to do is to get some tech support and some help to learn to be more adept at using the computer as a way to connect with other people. So many things now are really through technology that we can learn about resources that we all need to know about as we get older, that we can find out about things going on in our community. It's all kind of, it's all kind of happening online in terms of finding out about those things. So these are a few resources. And again, you'll get these slides. The ones on the left-hand side are free services to provide tech help. Can Do is a subscription service. It's relatively affordable though, where they can kind of mirror you on your computer and teach you what to do, but also help you problem solve if you get stuck with your computer and need help. There are also ways to make friends directly online, whether it's reconnecting with old friends, like looking on Facebook and see if you can find an old classmate that you've lost touch with, or an old, work friend that you'd like to reconnect with. It's amazing who you can find. There's also a group on Facebook called Elder Orphans, which is another term for solo aging. And it's quite a large group. I think there are tens of thousands of people in it. I gave the link here if you are a solo ager and want to join that group. There's also something called Nextdoor, which is kind of like a hyper local Facebook where you can connect with just the people in your community. One of my clients said she never got along better with her brother, who she had a rocky relationship with, until they stopped talking on the phone and started emailing. And it just kind of gave them the space to not have a hot reaction to something right away, to process it, to think about it, also to think before they respond so they didn't kind of start up old arguments again. And so to think about email when you're thinking about technology. Is it a way to reach out and connect with people? There's also something called meetup.com where you can meet people for a social situation in a group setting. You can filter on it so that you might say just looking for groups with older adults in, the North Shore, for example. And then what's going on where people are meeting up, and it's safe because it would be in a public place. So there might be, and I'm just making this up because I would have to look and see what's available now, but there might be a group for film lovers where they meet at a certain theater once a month, and you could meet people that way and it's safe, right? And Meetup is sort of a well-known kind of safe site, if you will, as long as you're meeting people in a public place. There's something called StitchNet that I don't really know about, but you pay $15 a month. It's just for older adults to connect online. I would say that the internet can also be really dangerous, as you all know, with so many scams and romance scams and financial fraud. And don't ever give anybody money. If you're not sure if something could be a scam, it's probably a scam. If you're not sure, just don't respond and check with somebody who's savvy about things like this. So you have to be aware, but certainly things like, emailing a friend, connecting with an old friend on Facebook are safe activities. Just don't ever give anybody any money. Kind of be a smart consumer and use the internet wisely, but it can be a great place to connect with people. And also to attend programs like today, right? You're all using the internet to connect with this program today. There's also something, I skipped a slide, through AARP. I strongly encourage you to check out this website if you're a solo ager. It's called Connect to Effect, and it's sponsored by AARP. And there's all kinds of resources on there and ways to connect. But one of the things they talk about is that Alexa or Google have what they call a social check-in. And using these smart devices, if you have one, they'll do a quick assessment with you to see, are you socially isolated? And then give you some resources in your community. Also, if you're not already familiar with it, the village model is kind of a loose network of organizations. Each chapter, if you will, is a little bit different. But the idea is self-help for older people to help them age in place. Some of them just have outings and social connections and a kind of a calendar of events. Some of them, you might be able to volunteer your time to help an older person in your community, like give them a ride to the doctor, and then you'd actually be like banking some hours if you needed help later on in sort of a bartering arrangement with time. Most of them have resources to supports in your community. And so the one for the North Shore is called North Shore Village, but there are a number of other ones like downtown, it's the Skyline Village. These are wonderful networks. Some are free, some have a small membership fee, but pretty affordable. Some have scholarships if you can't afford the membership fee. There's something nationally called the Transition Network, which is a community of women. It's an inclusive community, and they've got chapters in Chicago and elsewhere. And they have a group for solo agers that meets in person and on Zoom. So I want to make you aware of that, and that's their web address there. There's something called Front Porch. That's not just for solo agers, but they have a social call program where somebody can connect with you for a friendly conversation, and they have an online community. Oops, something happened with my slides. Let me go back. There's one I just learned about that I'm really excited to share with you. It's called DeRote USA, and it's an organization just for solo agers. It's a national organization. They happen to offer tech coaching, incidentally, but they also have this 6-week workshop that can be done virtually for people who are solo aging. Like, you know, imagine a 6-hour version of this, but also a way to connect to other people. So strongly, and you don't have to do the 6-week program to find out about their other resources and programs. So do check that out, DeRoteusa.org. I would be remiss if I didn't, oh, did I mute? Oh no, I'm just pinned. You can hear me, right? Okay. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention CJE. We have a cyber club, and we hope you'll check out our online activities and as well as our in-person programming. I also just remind people about things like the Park District and senior centers, and sometimes the things that my clients would kind of wave away, like, I feel too young for that, or, well, I don't know if they have anything for me. Check those things out. They're usually free or incredibly low cost, and just see what's there. And you might be surprised at like all the things the park districts offer for seniors, for example. Also helping other people, doing something to volunteer can be a way to stay connected, or a new hobby is a way to meet people. The other thing is animals are so good for our health and for our sense of connection. And sometimes as people age, they're like, I don't know if I want to adopt a new pet, but you can foster too, which means it's a short-term commitment until that animal gets a forever home, but you still get the pleasure of getting to interact with a dog or cat or whatever is a good fit for you. So that's another option to consider. And then I wanted to just say, sometimes people say, well, you've given me all these resources, you've convinced me it's important to connect, but I'm just not connecting. I still feel lonely. And for some people, that's not just that they've had a recent loss or moved, or, you know, it's not a temporary condition. It's more a chronic condition, feeling lonely. And then I think we need to ask ourselves questions, what's going on and what can we do about that? For some people, it is because they've had losses, and it's really hard. I hear again and again from my clients, like, it's just hard to make those close friendships later in life that I had when I was in school or when I was working. And it's true. I don't mean to minimize that. But it may take some work on your part, and even forcing yourself to set some goals. So that you are beginning to take some small steps into the world of making new connections in some of the ways we've talked about today. If you've always lacked a support system, that can be important to take stock of and say, what's going on with me? How can I strengthen relationships? One of the things my clients often say to me is, my phone never rings, nobody calls me. And I do say, well, are you calling anybody else? I think we all kind of wish that somebody would reach out to us, but it's a two-way thing. And sometimes it is something where you may have to reach out more than the other person for whatever reason. I'm bad, I have to be honest, at reaching out to people, and yet I'm always delighted when people call me. I'm happy to connect with them, but sometimes like just energy level or other things get in the way. So I would encourage you to think about things you can do to take that first step. The other thing is sometimes we have cutoffs from other people because we feel hurt about something or angry about something. But is there a possibility to repair that relationship if it was a good relationship and important to you in the past? And I always think of something one of my clients said that I think was really wise. She said, not everything is forgivable, but I've learned to just step over it so that I can continue on a relationship with somebody. And I thought that was really so, moving, that we don't even always have to forgive. Sometimes, that thing is there, it happened, and it's upsetting to us, and maybe we don't even have to forgive it. But can you step over it? Not everything, certainly in the case of abuse or whatever, is reparable. But some things where it's just a hurt feeling, or you wish somebody would have responded in a different way, we can learn to step over it and repair a relationship. I think, sometimes following our natural interests can be a way to connect. Instead of having the goal be to connect, can the goal be to, take an art class, something that's naturally interesting to you, and then maybe social connections will follow. Things like exercising that maybe you're doing anyway, like if you're walking every day, could you join a walking club? Like that village movement that I was talking about, I think they have walking clubs. Senior centers may have walking clubs. Making sure if you are retired that you do have some scheduled activities every day. Those are, that's kind of good for your health, but it's also good for social connection. The other thing I hear often from my clients is that they may, if they live in like a senior community, that they may have activities during the day, but then nothing at night. And so I think to remember, it's okay to invite somebody over for coffee. The worst that can happen is they'll say no, and you have to kind of prepare yourself for that in advance. But a lot of people would probably be delighted if you said you want to come over for a cup of coffee. It's low commitment. You don't have to clean the whole house. You don't have to make a meal, right? Or go out to Starbucks for a cup of coffee. The other thing I found from my clients who do, I hear very often from my clients, my neighborhood has changed. It's very different culturally than it once was. And I have a hard time connecting. And so I don't bother with the neighbors. I used to be friends with my neighbors. And I think it's just worth mentioning, of course, it can be really challenging if neighbors don't speak the same language. That may not be something you can overcome too well. But if that's not the issue, don't kind of presuppose that you couldn't have really interesting and meaningful connections with people, even if they're a different age, even if they're from a different cultural background than you or a different faith background. It's amazing how people can connect. One of my clients, she would be going to dinner at different people's houses every night of the week who are very culturally different, or inviting people over for a Shabbat dinner, a Jewish Friday evening dinner, who were not Jewish. And, they might garden together or share plants together or share a recipe. And it was really, because she was open to it and she had that kind of personality, she didn't say like, oh, we're not going to have anything in common. I'm American and they're Vietnamese or whatever, but they found commonality. And so just to not rule out those kinds of relationships with neighbors. And here's just a few tips. I'm not going to go into them in detail. I want to have time at the end, but questions to ask yourself if you're lonely about some of the things. And here's where gratitude comes in. Sometimes if we can focus on just one or two things a day that we do feel gratitude for, that kind of attitude can draw people to us. Whereas sometimes if we're feeling very negative, it can kind of repel people. And not that you shouldn't be authentic and honest and share with people that you're close to how you're feeling, but sometimes just sharing something positive that's genuine, not something, phony, but like things that clients have said to me that they wrote down in a gratitude journal was just the warmth of a steam kettle on a cold day as they were heating up a cup of, heating up the water for tea was a pleasure, something that they noticed and that they felt grateful for. Somebody talked about just listening to a beautiful piece of music, or just in the fall, the crunch, we'll get to experience this soon enough, the crunch of the leaves under their feet in the fall. Just taking the time to be present in the moment and notice little things that, and to be grateful for things that we experience and pleasure for. By the way, there's a great book called The Book of Delights, and it's just somebody who spent a whole year noticing these things that gave him pleasure and writing little essays about them. So things like that we can focus on and feel grateful for. And it doesn't mean that there aren't things that are really challenging and hard at the same time. Sometimes asking people for honest feedback, like, I noticed we don't see each other as much as we did, or you said you don't want to see me anymore. Like, can you be really honest with me? I'd like to know. I'm not trying to change your mind, but can you give me some honest feedback? Or considering counseling if you're feeling chronically isolated and lonely and it's proving a tough thing to solve for you. Sometimes it's social anxiety. I've worked with a lot of people over the years who are, lovely people, and they're very socially isolated. And it's because they have a lot of social anxiety, and there's help for that. But they become so avoidant and afraid to connect with people because of that. So do consider counseling, including at CJE SeniorLife or at any of the local providers. We're happy to help you connect with one, so that you can work on some of those issues that might be leading you to be isolated. And here's more information about our mental health services at CJE, and you'll get this slide. Oh, but I wanted to be sure to mention that we have a group for solo agers. It's called Aging Together, and it meets twice a month. It was on a little hiatus because the leader left CJE, and now we have new leaders, and the group I think is starting again today, and they're open to new members, and you access all of our services through 773-508-1000. If anybody's interested, it's an online group for solo agers. Please consider joining that group. How do you ask for support and help? First of all, I think it's important to know, well, let me pause before I get into this. We'll have time for the questions at the end, but any questions now or concerns or things people want to share? And don't be afraid to unmute because I can't see everybody.
Sharon, I'm just going to say you can also put stuff in the chat box too, and I'll relay the message too.
Great. Okay, so for now, I'll continue on. So asking for support, I think it's important to think, how do you feel usually when somebody asks you for help or support? And very often, we're very happy to help other people. It even feels good to be asked. I helped a friend who's starting a new bakery business hand out samples for 4 hours downtown this weekend. And, she went on and on about how grateful she was. And I was like, honestly, you do so much for me. I was so happy you asked me for a favor. I was happy to be able to give back. So keep that in mind. If you need to ask for somebody to give you a ride to the doctor or for somebody to help you in some way, very often people are more than happy to help. But do be sure that there's some reciprocity, right? If you're asking the same friend to drive you to the doctor 10 times, that might feel a lot different than if you ask one time. Is there something you can do in exchange? And, can you pet sit for somebody if they're willing to give you a ride from time to time or whatever it might be? And you can also say, I want you to tell me if this feels like too much, because I have some other options. Be honest. Please tell me if it's too much. You absolutely can say no, it's okay. So you're kind of giving people permission to, make an excuse or say it's too much. And then sometimes you need to, use a volunteer network, a more formal volunteer network, or pay for somebody to take you, or get help from the community care program for somebody to take you, or I'm using transportation as an example. But there are many ways in which solo agers kind of need to rely on other people for help. That's often the number one fear. What am I going to do when I need help if there's nobody there for me. So kind of developing these networks of support can be really important. And then you also need to do a lot of planning as a solo ager in terms of advanced planning. This is important for everybody, solo ager or not, but it's really critical for solo agers so that you can really have a plan in place and be sure your wishes are followed. It's very common, by the way, for folks to not have an available family caregiver as they age. About 25, almost a quarter of baby boomers will be in that situation. So it's important to know there are ways to get caregiving help if you need it as you age or if you need it now. I mentioned the village movement. There's friends and family for those who have them. There are paid caregivers, which can be very costly, but many people need to use. For those who have less than $17,500 in savings in the bank, not counting your house, you're eligible for the community care program if you need help around the house or in other ways as you age. And I put the link there, but that's the number one way if you're low income to get free help at home. Sometimes people choose to move to a more supportive environment. And the one that people often don't know about, again, for folks who may have more limited financial means, is supportive living. So I put a link here. It's sort of like assisted living, but it's paid for by the government. So you'd have your own apartment and everything, but you could get some day-to-day help, and you have to pay a share through your Social Security check, but otherwise it's covered through a government subsidy. So that's an important thing to know about as a way to get help, especially for solo agers. And then you should think about doing advanced directives, talking to an attorney. In CJE, we have a free legal clinic that helps, again, 773-508-1000. You'll get the slides that helps people do advanced directives. And by the way, we help people of all faiths. You don't have to be Jewish. You can get a free power of attorney who's going to make healthcare decisions for you if you can't make them. They'll also help you to do what they call a what if binder, like just thinking all of it through. Who's going to help you with financial stuff? Who's going to help you with caregiving stuff? And if you're not sure, to help you think that through, because I realize some of you may not have anybody, and that's a huge challenge. So you can see an elder law attorney. We can help you with some of these documents free of charge. There's also something called a post that people should have if they have a serious or life-limiting illness. It's kind of like what used to be a DNR. And I also just recommend people set a deadline for doing all this. So, because otherwise, I've done this myself. It's like, oh yeah, I'm going to do that. Of course, why wouldn't I do that? I'm a social worker. Of course I need a power of attorney, but do I do it? No, time goes on and on and on. So set a deadline and say, like, by the end of this calendar year, I'm going to have that done, or by the end of next year, or whatever it is. Be generous in your timeline, but make sure you've got a deadline and it's on your calendar, or it'll never get done. And then you just need to think through, what do I do if I need help? What's my plan? If something happens, God forbid, where I were to fall and break a bone, who can help me? Who am I going to call? Where's that phone number? Is it in my phone? What if I go into the hospital and I have pets? Who's going to take care of them? You need a plan for all of this, and a backup plan. Sometimes I've had clients who had a neighbor who was going to take care of their cat, and then the neighbor's sick because it's another older person. And so could there be a backup too in those situations? There are private care managers, and that is somebody that you pay a fee to do a lot of the things for you that a family member might otherwise do, but they have special knowledge and experience in aging. It's often somebody like myself, a social worker. It could be a nurse. And sometimes it's not as expensive as you'd think. Even though it's certainly a costly service, but to just kind of keep it in the back burner might not be very expensive for when you really need it. And then there are nonprofits that often don't charge a fee out there that you can connect with. We're one of them. There's the National Elder Care Locator. I'm sure the YMCA is happy to help. For those who need mental health assistance more urgently, I just always want to share the number 988, which is like 911, but for mental health emergencies. It's 24 hours a day. and the Illinois Warm Line, which is not for an emergency so much as for emotional support. And it's Monday through Saturday, 8 to 8, and the number is here. So with that, I'm going to spend the rest of the time with any questions you have. I'm going to take down the slides, but really quickly, I just want to show you that at the end, there's all these additional things that you can connect with, including how to find a geriatric care manager. If you want to hire somebody to be your power of attorney because you don't have a trusted family member or friend, it's not that expensive. It's not free by any means, but these are some places that you could hire who do private pay power of attorney. We do not at CJE. These are some ways you can, when I talked about a what if binder to kind of put your plan together for as you age, these are some resources of how you can get that done. These are some transportation options. Some are, free and some are not. And then just the references for today. So let me just take that down and come back to all of you. And change my view so I can see everybody better. Okay, so we have just about 10 minutes left. Any reactions, questions, things you thought of and wanted to share? Things I didn't talk about that I should have, that I should include next time or might be able to address now?
I was just wondering, is there a way to get a copy of the resources?
Yes, I'm going to send it to the Y, and then you'll share it out.
Yeah, I can send it to everyone that's on the talk today.
Great. Does that answer the question? All right.
Yes,
Thanks.
thank you.
Sure. You're welcome. Yes. Lots of good stuff here. And so, feel free to keep it too, even if you don't need it today. There's lots of good stuff here that you might want to reference in the future. And feel free to share it if you know somebody who's a solo ager, or frankly, 90% of those resources are good for people, whether they're a solo ager or not. A few of them are specific to solo agers. Any other comments, questions, reactions?
I just want to thank you for the information. It certainly has a lot of information to think about, to prepare for the future, even though you don't need it right now. It's good to prepare. It's good to think about the near future. So thank you so much.
You're so welcome, and thank you for saying that. It's not easy, I think it's easy to tell people they need to prepare, but to actually prepare, life is going on. There's so many other things demanding our attention, and kind of making a plan for the future probably doesn't either cross our minds or we don't make time for it. But
Yeah,
it
it's
is
not a
so important.
priority. Mm-hmm.
For people who need affordable housing as they age, we often have people come to us and say, oh my gosh, my rent is so expensive, I have to move. Do you have subsidized housing? And then we have to tell people the waiting list is like years for many places. And so it's never too soon to put yourself on those lists now. And so maybe when you need it down the road in a few years or 5 years even, your name will come up. And that's just one example of how planning really makes the difference, even though nobody wants to do it, and I don't blame you one bit. Anything else? Otherwise, we'll let you go, right?
Yeah, I was just gonna say I agree, like with the kind of preparing yourself, it's never too soon. And then also reaching out and finding things that are gonna make you feel good, and finding new hobbies like you mentioned, Sharon. And I just feel like it's never too soon to be prepared for things and to build on those relationships. And it's just been this has been helpful and informative. So
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
if anybody has any questions, and if you come up with questions later on, feel free to email myself, Sharon, I believe. I can send emails along to you as well.
Please.
And then also Sharon mentioned the phone number for CJE at 773-508-1000.
1,000. Right.
Yeah, so it seems like you have very valuable resources and are able to help everybody. So it's a great place to start.
We're happy to help. That's what we're here for.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, I think we might we'll end this. Once we are able to email the slides with all those links and resources, we'll get those to everybody that's been on the chat today. And I want to thank Sharon on behalf of the North Suburban YMCA. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate your time and your valuable insights. It's just been wonderful chatting with you this past hour.
Thank you so much. Be well, everybody.
Okay.
Thanks for sharing the information.
You're so welcome.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.